Yeah, so I was waiting for you to be done there. Yeah, so I would agree with that. And I've thought about this a lot. I'm a biologist, I'm a scientist. But anyway, I deal in fact and rather than just opinion, and I think that has been noted in my initial testimony that I provided, and as well as some of the follow-up I've talked about here, which is missing information. We can't really determine what the geohazards are and how the pipe needs to be anchored into the steep slopes and things like that, because we just don't know. Again, concern about the amount or level of field surveys for wetlands water bodies. I did have a discussion with staff, so I could deal with easements versus field surveys for wetlands, so I think I got that clarified in my head. But there's still missing information, and to make a determination on permit applicability, the federal or state agency has to make that, that determination. As far as whether sufficient information has been collected and presented for the commission to make a decision, they have different standards than, say, environmental and things like that. So it's a little different standard, but there's definitely missing information.
And in terms of the example, which I thought was a good one, you brought up that maybe there's some federal oversight on, if we use the legal term of our wetlands, connected to or would having nexus with a flowing waterway versus a wetland as maybe we understand it or a farmer might understand it. Would you agree with me that regardless of which acronym of federal or state government has oversight or joint oversight over wetlands or any of these features, that when they're located on a person's land, that it's reasonable for that person to have concern about navigators' plans and missing information, regardless of who has the oversight?
Object to the form of the question to the extent it mischaracterizes federal law.
Ask your question in a different way.
Okay, I'll try to ask it shorter. At the end of the day, we could squabble over federal, where their jurisdiction stops and starts, or where the state is involved when we're using the term wetland. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it would be the state or federal agency that would claim jurisdiction. And I think it's an important thing to note for permitting reasons. Who claims jurisdiction over that resource?
Exactly. And could you just talk just a little bit more? I mean, it's important, but give us the why from your perspective, and kind of, if you can, tie it back to the analysis we're trying to do here vis-a-vis this particular route selection.
The why is specific to the word nexus and the definition of water of the United States. So if a wetland water body meets that definition, then that resource will be claimed jurisdictional by the federal agency. If the Corps of Engineers determines a wetland or water body, probably defer just to wetland, if they claim they do not have jurisdiction because it doesn't have a nexus or a connection to another water body and another water body or wetland, then they defer to the state. And in this case, DNR would claim jurisdiction as a state or, quote, isolated, not connected water resource. So that's how they're differentiated, and the why comes down to the definition at the federal level.
And you made a distinction between, along those lines, that basically navigable waterways or commercial waterways versus, I think you said, seeps and springs and flows. There was some testimony yesterday, and Navigator has some data related to rivers and streams, but after that, we don't know much else of waterways. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of not having that information?
Object to the form of the question and the mischaracterization of evidence that's already been presented.
Overruled.
So as far as relating back to navigable waterways, there's a long history, and it's been challenged in the court system over many, many years on what is considered navigable in a variety of different settings. In my area, Pennsylvania, the Juniata River, which is a dammed river, you can't ship goods for a commerce reason because there are obstacles. But it used to be, or historically, used for those purposes. So the Juniata River is still claimed as a navigable waterway because it has had a historical use for that. The fact of commerce comes into that definition. Every state's going to be a little different. I don't, as far as commerce and the definition of navigable for South Dakota, I'm not familiar with. It doesn't really come into play with considering jurisdictionality of the Corps for a wetland or for the state for an isolated wetland. When I talked about drainage features and identifying springs, seeps, things like that, it also has things to do with inline flow, with infiltration. So seeps and springs are areas where water discharges from the ground. Infiltration areas are obviously where water goes into the ground. They're highly desirable because it recharges the groundwater. It actually supports a couple of things: flow in streams, and also supports the water regime of wells.
And is it true, based on the review of your materials and the work you've done here, that there simply is a lack or void of information related to the seeps and flows and springs, so that analysis can be made of the potential negative impacts?
I just didn't see those located on any mapping or discussed in the application or supplemental testimony, either positive or negative. We just don't see them. I don't know where they are.
And to your point, the recharge, obviously that's important for the aquifer, which is important for the economic and social well-being of the state, and certainly farmers who irrigate. Do you understand that?
Absolutely.
You talked about thermal effects on the soils, and that can come from the temperature of the pipe and how far the temperature has to migrate before the temperature kind of equalizes, and then also when they're discharging water or other type of fluids during any type of testing or maintenance. Why would it be important for us to have more information to inform the effects on the soil temperatures?
Again, as a biologist, I'm not a soil scientist. It's not my specialty. But I do know that if you have higher temperatures that are applied to surface soils, it will absolutely affect the biology, the microbes, bacteria in the soil. So that needs to be managed. You need to know what the temperature is. So part of my concern is how would those temperatures be measured? The equipment used should have a mechanical feature that would allow the temperature or sensor to be determined. And twofold. So for the hydrostatic discharge water, which I know through supplemental testimony, Navigator has included a commitment to allow that water to stay in the pipe for 12 hours to normalize to ambient ground, soil temperatures. Again, my question is, okay, how is that determined? I just don't know. It just wasn't discussed in the application for the rebuttal testimony. And the other is the temperature of the surrounding soils that may be affected by the compressed and supercritical CO2, where it was mentioned in the application that soil would normalize about a mile from where it is injected into the system. My question is, what are those temperatures as it gets closer to the injection site? It just wasn't discussed. It's absent. I don't know.
And would you agree that if we don't have the temperatures, we don't have that information, then we're unable to make conclusions, positive or negative, as to the effects or possible negative effects on the soil fertility, or other categories of concern?
Yeah, we just don't know that information. It may exist. I mean, for somebody to make a statement that ambient soil temperatures around a pipeline were normalized for a mile, if they make that determination, they may have done some type of analysis to know what temperatures there are as it leads back closer to the injection site. I just don't know. I just haven't seen it.
Right, and again, you understand farmers' concerns about the soil temperature, which can affect germination, which can affect the growth of corn or soybean plants, and why that information would be important to know from their perspective.
Yes, so the location of the mainline valve or any surface feature associated with the system, when those pipes get closer to the surface, I don't know I haven't seen any specific details on the spacing requirements, the buffer distances, fencing, and how close crops would be to those surface features. So if there are deep-rooted crops, deeper-rooted crops closer to that, to those features, they may be affected more than if it's further away. Again, I just don't know because I haven't seen that information.
All right. I appreciate that, sir. Nothing further. Thank you.
That will bring us over here for commission questions, and we'll go to Commissioner Nelson.
Good morning. Thanks for being here to help us sort this out. I want to go right to the questions that were just being talked about as it relates to temperature affecting the biology of the soil. A navigator witness earlier in this hearing testified that the temperature of the carbon dioxide coming out of the plant would be about 120 degrees. And then I specifically asked about what's the gradient, at what point does it normalize ground temperature, and the answer was 5 to 10 miles. So we're talking a significant difference. The question I've got for you is, given the fact that temperature affects the biology of the soil, and that this pipeline is proposed to run in perpetuity, would that permanently change the soil biology where that temperature is different than what it normally would be?
Again, I'm not a soil scientist. I haven't done any evaluation on that. My opinion is that when I talk about soil biology, it really is an aerobic condition. So really it's that more surface soils that have more oxygen in them. That's where really the life of the soil is, the soil health. The deeper you go, it can become an anaerobic condition. And actually for wetlands, that's what you look for. There's anaerobic conditions that produce different characteristics of wetlands. That's why the soils look quite different. The mineral soils look quite different than wetland soils because they develop under anaerobic conditions. So that, if I recall correctly, the pipeline proposed is 5 feet below ground surface. And I think I read at the top of the pipe to be 5 feet below ground surface, other than where it approaches surface features. There's going to be less life, less aerobic activity in those deeper zones. So less of a concern for soil biology, is really more towards the surface. But you're right, there's a definite difference in what I read is a mile from injection sites to what you just mentioned. And I did not hear that testimony, but yes.
And even if we were to look at right outside the emission source where it actually is 120 degrees, we really don't know what the soil temperature is going to be at 4 feet or 3 feet or 2 feet when we start getting into that aerobic area of soil, correct?
That's correct. We just don't know it. I haven't seen any of that data.
And so any change in productivity, and again, this would be for the life of the operating pipeline, could be positive, could be negative. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
From your testimony on page 5, and we're going to be in line 183 and 184, you state that the application and ECG do not discuss the potential impacts of operating heavy equipment on wet soils. So I've got an extensive farm ranch background, and even light vehicles can make an absolute mess in wet soils. Heavy vehicles, it can create damage that'll last a long time. So my question is, have you found anything in any of the additional information Navigator has submitted that would mitigate your statement here?
And I'll say yes and no. In the rebuttal of Monica, I believe, the information was provided that contractors would use low ground pressure equipment to avoid rutting and things like that that would occur in wet soils, and then they would mitigate for that and potential compaction of soils. The way I look at it is, why mitigate if you can avoid? Apply the same rule that we talked about that was provided yesterday in testimony, the general process of avoid impacts, minimize impacts, and then mitigate impacts. Why go right to mitigate? Just try and avoid. So the NRCS encourages farmers to use an approach that they call wait another day. So if you've got wet soils, even tractors can compress, compact those soils. And once soils are compacted, it's not just the surface, but rocks, any fragments that really make up the body of the soil, they can get crushed. And in my exposure experience with pipeline construction, I'm not aware of low ground pressure equipment. That involves like big rubber tires, often used in logging operations, because they'll cross streams and things like that in accordance with the permits. And also wetland mitigation projects where you don't want to make ruts. Sometimes you do for habitat, but low ground pressure type of equipment, I'm not aware that really is used in pipeline construction. Those are heavy pieces of equipment, usually tracked equipment, that will run along the segments. And pipeline is assembled along the trench, completely welded, and then boom type of equipment lifts the pipe, puts it in. And if you have good contractors, they'll just push it in and it'll goes right down and use minimal involvement. But it's heavy equipment will definitely be used, and it'll be running back and forth. So they can avoid conversion over wet soils to avoid impact. Traversing over wet soils definitely would be a way to minimize impacts and avoid soil compaction.
And so your belief is that it all depends on what kind of year we've got. If they're constructing this year, it might be not too bad, but there are years when it is really wet. And so your belief is there may be times when construction's not going to happen today. In order for the life and the health and the productivity of the soil, construction may need to wait. Is that what I'm hearing?
That would be correct. And being around capital projects and contractors, contractors want to work. So that would be a role of an environmental inspector. So whether they're hired directly by Navigator, I think I've heard that. That's a great idea. I know I've worked on FERC projects before, and for natural gas and liquefied natural gas pipelines. And their common practice is to provide a third-party environmental inspector. And in this case, either hired by the PUC or at some level, that's a contract issue, but that third-party environmental inspector would make those decisions. It's too wet, we're going to use the NRCS approach, let's wait another day, see what happens, see if the soils can dry out to avoid compaction.
The decision that you've just talked about, do we go out there today or do we not? Those are decisions that farmers make all the time. The crop's got to come out, but it's too wet. Do we go today? Do we not go today? Would you agree, though, that when a farmer's making that decision, they know at the end of the day that preservation of the property is of the utmost importance.
I would think that's a general statement that I would agree with. I know, but I live in a heavy agricultural area. Unfortunately, there's a lot more houses popping up, but it's heavily agricultural, and oftentimes, you know, you're right, farmers will put off what they want to do because of weather. It depends on, you know, their attitude to the project too. So I think there's some open-ended questions there, maybe a separate issue on what they would agree to versus what the weather permits and things like that. But I understand the concern. I generally agree.
Thank you. So, since you're covering a lot of bases today, we're going to go to the Bronson testimony on page 5. And I'm looking at line 178, 179. And there it says, the proposed route crosses soil types that could inhibit future revegetation of ground disturbed during construction activities, maybe continuing from our last discussion. But tell me what you mean by that, or what she meant by statement.
So revegetation, so after a disturbance, ground disturbance, and by permit, the soil needs to be revegetated. How it's revegetated is I think in this case is an agreement between the landowner and then regulatory-wise by the erosion sedimentation control plan. It has to be stabilized so you don't end up with erosional conditions, things like that. The concern is, again, wet soils. There are a lot of areas along the pipeline. In fact, I think most of it has soils that are susceptible to, they have a high rutting potential. So equipment going back and forth, particularly on wet conditions, will aggravate that situation and do a couple of things. Number one, it creates the rut. So then you have to come back, use heavy equipment to, usually it's called back dragging, just to level out those ruts, make it level so you can plant that. And then the other is compaction of the soils. And it kind of follows a couple different routes. Number one, so compaction has occurred, so what are you going to do about it? Which Navigator has proposed using, I believe, 2 primary methods, disking and also using a ripper on the back of a bulldozer or something like that. And it depends on whether it's cropland, agricultural use, or it's non-agricultural use. It depends on whether they go down 12 inches or 18 inches. And I actually had to look this up, what would be appropriate for the area. In my area, we have a very deep topsoil. Here, not so much. And so the plow line, and that's what I was looking up, was the plow line, where the crops really need to take a hold and revegetate. It's a lot less shallow here than in my area. It's very common for plows to go down 24 inches and a little bit more in our area. We have a lot of topsoil. So I actually did a little bit of research to figure out what the appropriate, and it looks like the application is appropriate for that type of mitigating any type of compacted soil, things like that. I do like to go back to the avoid, minimize, then mitigate approach. So if you can avoid the compaction, try to do that as well.
And so, based on what you read in their environmental plan and their ag practices plan, do you believe that they adequately understand how to do and have committed to attaining full revegetation?
From what I've read and heard today, it sounds like the commitment is there. I haven't read like the how. And I used to drive my mom nuts. I'm a how, when, why person with questions. And some of that type of detail is how is that information going to be communicated and monitored to the contractor. I have a wide experience with contractors and don't trust very many of them. they cut corners, and they need to have some oversight. And so I was glad to hear that Navigator has their own proposed inspectors, and that's why I mentioned about the third party as well.
The last question on this topic, you mentioned that you'd observed Navigator talking about using deep ripping and disking to remove compaction, correct?
Correct.
Are you aware that disking actually creates compaction?
I am.
Thank you.
Yes.
And now going to the Perella testimony. And I think maybe this question kind of carries over from what we were just talking about, and maybe you've already answered this, but on page 4, the first question, there's a statement that there are industry BMPs that would minimize any ongoing crop yield loss along the pipeline right-of-way. And so the things that we were just talking about in revegetation would probably also apply to mitigating long-term crop loss. Is that accurate?
It can be. Again, it depends how it's done, and even to your earlier question, again, how things are done, the order of the way that they're done, and because ultimately you need to provide a fairly level area. If you disc or rip up the areas and it's in an agricultural setting, you have to get it into a condition that the farmer can utilize their equipment and things like that with the goal of reestablishing crop production.
If you've read what Navigator has said they're going to do, if you were recommending to us any mandatory conditions for us to impose upon them to make sure that revegetation and maximization of crop production occurs as quickly as possible after construction, those kinds of things, are there any items that you would recommend to us sitting here today?
Well, I'll say I'm not an agricultural expert. I grew around farmland across the street from a dairy farm. But I would say implementation of a third-party environmental inspector would certainly help, because that needs to follow through on commitments. Also, paying attention, making sure that the contractors have some conditions on working in wet weather to avoid soil compaction. And then also some type of a monitoring of the reestablishment of and monitoring the production of agricultural production of different properties.
Thank you. I appreciate you being here.
Chairman Vegan.
Thank you so much for being here from Pennsylvania, right?
Yes.
Cranberry Township.
That's where my office is or was, but yes. So I'm a little bit east of that, but yes.
In South Dakota, when we think township, we think not a population, so that is actually a city.
Cranberry itself is, actually they're a township, so they're an incorporated area. I live in a rather rural area. We have corn, soybeans, and some grains and things like that, but it's heavily agricultural.
How about carbon pipelines? Do you have carbon pipelines in that area?
We don't, natural gas.
So Commissioner Nelson asked a lot of questions that I was concerned about. Well, we're going to go to a few more. You work for environmental resources management, correct? And there were several of you that were hired to be expert witnesses for the Public Utilities Commission staff that is a party in the docket. The 3 commissioners don't get to talk to the staff, don't get to talk to you until today about this. So the staff has done several discoveries and you understand discovery processes. Did your management team give discovery questions to the PUC staff?
They may have, I would think. I came in very late in the process, and so I believe one of the questions I had came after the discovery. So we just waited until other information came back out, supporting information, rebuttal information to look for that information, which actually part of that was the timing of field surveys for wetlands.
So you didn't work as a staff together to know if there were questions asked and maybe you didn't receive the information in a timely manner?
It was a matter of timing, like when I was brought on board to support the staff.
I loved a couple of your comments today. I think I'm going to keep them forever now on a notepad. Wait another day. I love that. Wait another day. And then the other one is fact versus opinion. Because when the Public Utilities Commission makes their decision, it has to be based on facts and evidence. It can't be our opinion, so I appreciate that. We're going to go to your testimony. In your testimony, and so I have the Rick's testimony. We're going to go to your last couple pages. We're going to start at 10. Or, let's see, page 10. Way at the top is your first question. And do you have any recommendations for addition? Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. Way at the bottom, it talks about the applicant's response to any needed repairs should be quick and comprehensive. So how do we make that detailed in a condition or however, so this applicant understands the need for that? Because in the past, the South Dakota Public Utilities Commission continues to get inquiries from landowners that pipelines have went over them, and that's been a struggle. So do you have any suggestions for quick and comprehensive response?
Yes, so the quick is, number one, quickly identifying that there is an issue. So having eyes on the ground, that's where the inspectors come in. Also, some training, perhaps with contractors. Using contractors that have experience always helps. And so identifying those problems early and getting action on it, perhaps stockpiling materials. If rock is needed to stabilize an area, if seed is needed to stabilize an area, if either silt fencing, and there are various types of silt fence, need to be installed as I'll say as a defensive measure, maybe it's work on a slope, and that will be installed in areas to prevent the acceleration. It's really the velocity of the water that causes erosion. So if you can stop it before it starts, that's the way to do it. So taking those preventative measures initially, again, relying on inspectors and informed, experienced contractors is always the way to go. And stockpiling materials is readily available. It could be rock and whatever it is. So that's one thing. When I talk about a comprehensive response, it's going back to the understanding of when erosion starts, and with the idea of revegetation is really what we're talking about, but it can be completely undermined by erosion. It just takes the soil away, and it's going to deposit it in the stream. That's where it's going to go if it isn't into a vegetated area, which can be a process. That can happen too. But taking preventative measures to prevent that accelerated erosion from occurring is part of that comprehensive measure. And so if a rut forms, or a rill, it's a type of a rut, it forms, it should be addressed at the very, very top to prevent that from ever starting. And it can be a challenge, to do that. Once soils start to erode, you're always chasing it back up, up the hill. And so that's what I mean by that. And the quick is very important because you have to have eyes on it and know these things.
Okay, and the word for the day, I love the word avoidance. Okay, that's a good one. Let's avoid it so we don't have to mitigate it. So that's very good. The next question that you have on that same page, you have concerns about bald eagles and when they did their survey. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I looked at, there's a table of breeding periods of different birds, and I noticed that it wasn't just the bald eagle, but that was the one most glaring to me was the breeding time zone. That was really in the fall, in the summer and fall. That's just not when they breed. They get to the nests pretty early, February, March, lay the eggs, and then the young, roost the nest, they leave the nest in June, July. I think I provided those dates in my testimony. And I am familiar with the bald eagle. I've done a number of studies of bald eagle and osprey protection plan for a major company. Just did that just a couple of years ago. So I know some of the habits and things, I'll say habits, whatever, and habitat of bald eagle. And have those around my house too, so it's pretty nice.
So in a nutshell, Navigator did a survey, but didn't use the correct timing to do it for accurate information, as accurate information or comprehensive.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the relevance to that is to directly apply that to, I'll say the longer bat, which is clearing operations, and more relevant in my area where there's a lot of trees, big trees. There are restrictions on when those trees and vegetation can be removed. So whether it's a bald eagle that may either have a nest in it or is suitable for a nest, and there's other species too, just using that as an example, the timing of the operations that were needed to clear the right-of-way for a project like Navigator, you need to know the time zones for when those species are using the nest and when they're breeding. Or if it's a bat, roosting, because they roost in trees. It's still different than an egg-laying bird, but that's the thought behind the concern is that the data need to be right. It's public information. Just get on the data's website.
And then the last question on that page, and you may have addressed this, and my ears might have not been listening well enough. You had concerns about livestock and large game, and the avoidance, possibly, I love that word, to a pipeline trench. Were you comfortable with Navigator's response to that?
No, I didn't think it was complete. I thought it was just a partial response. And my question is, how or if that happens, it's rare, but if that happens, an animal would be trapped in a trench or an open excavation, what's the plan to get them out? Is it, certainly involve landowners and livestock, but having the capacity, the capability of getting that, that animal out needs to be addressed somehow. And I just didn't see any specific information there.
We're going to go back to the geohazard, phase 2. So you were asked from Navigator a little bit about phase 2 and how comfortable you would be if it came back to another agency. So the Public Utilities Commission certainly is given authority on pipeline siting, and we have certain items that we need to look at. the legislature has given that to us. It's not about checking the box, because somebody else could do that, and they wouldn't give us this authority if it was all about checking the box. So do you believe it would be helpful for the phase 2 to be completed and the commission can look at it before we make a decision, according to the state law of the authority they have given us?
Yeah, definitely would be helpful. The more information you have really about anything, the more knowledge you have, knowledge is power. Just question everything. I teach my kids that. Just ask a lot of questions.
Facts versus opinion.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so your team that has worked on this, there has been several items that they have looked at that there has been a vague promise from the applicant, but not a lot of detail backing that promise up. So as expert witnesses, does that concern you to be an expert witness and giving expert advice to the 3 commissioners when you don't have all the details to all the items that you're reviewing?
Yeah, yes, we have to be very careful. Again, we're all scientists here to provide testimony from my company, including the people that I'm adopting the testimony. And so, again, the more information we have to make a conclusion and our statements that we've provided definitely helps to have that. And having the full information of the geotechnical, geohazard analysis really supports the design. The design can't be completed until that's finished because you don't know how to anchor and anchor the pipeline and steep slopes, perhaps areas where the rock is not as stable, where soil stability even comes into question. It might be the characteristics of the soil, or even it's a steep slope and just getting stabilization of vegetation on that fill. It becomes fill over top of the slope, getting that established as fast as possible. It just becomes a process, and that process being in the form of getting that commitment or solidifying that commitment can be in the form of conditions, just like a federal or state agency would do with the permit conditions, things like that, and having that commitment solidified that way. With any type of capital project, there's always a schedule driving things, but there's also a sequence. Something has to be done before the next, before the next, before the next. And that sequence of information gathering, documentation, it can change. But in my experience, agricultural resources, part of a NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act type of project, always ends at the cultural resources, and a clearance from the State Historic Preservation Office comes last. It is always, this seems to be the schedule driver in my experience. So you have to, each project is different. You have to identify what are the drivers, what tasks can slip a little bit, what's more important to make decisions, design, things like that. And I think the geotech and geohazards, knowing and reading the information about the Katarsia incident and the hazards associated with CO2, and I had to learn that just from the research. But knowing the results of the geohazard analysis will certainly be helpful to know what design elements need to be included in those sections of pipeline.
Thank you, because it's all about bringing all the pieces of puzzles together from all the different agencies. And it's kind of like a physician. If you have a family physician, they hear from all your other doctors, and then they try not to have medication that conflicts with other medications. information. That's, I believe, the role of the Public Utilities Commission, is to look at all the information that's coming from different agencies and make a decision how the state legislature is asking us to make. Because sometimes when you're in a silo out there, you may not have all the information to the design of the pipeline. And so a state geologist might not understand the specs that the PUC is looking at on geohazard. So that's why I think that the state legislature possibly has given us the authority to look at everything. Because you can't look at things in a silo.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Commissioner Hanson.
Mr. Stern, welcome to South Dakota
Thank you.
on the Thomas Paine State. You adopted Cottrell, Perella, and Franson. We were hoping that you'd adopt John Thurber's testimony as well.
I don't believe I heard that personally.
He said it was, he's seated to your right there, staff member. I'm going to ask you a question about each one of those, including yours, in an effort to try to save time, instead of asking questions on each one. It's nearly 12:30 here. And instead of going through all of them, I think I can make it more quickly. If I ask the question on each one, do you have any concerns with Ms. Howard's rebuttal, I've got page numbers here on each one, to your testimony? Or to, we can start out with that question to Cottrell, if you wish, instead of trying to go through each page.
Yeah, that's fine. I think the one, I would say exception, or one question I still have is why the application separates the carbon capture pieces of the project. And when I say that, I think in terms of permit, what's required for the permit. And it appears this project is going to go through the Corps of Engineers to get federal permit, whether it's a nationwide or if it depends on the impacts and their Corps' determination whether it goes to a Section 404 permit. And I reference that because they look at projects that are complete and have independent utility. And so if the pipeline is built, the question in my mind to satisfy the permit is whether it has independent utility, can it stand on its own, can it operate on its own. And I didn't see that without taking into account the carbon capture. So that was one of the questions I had. And, I don't think it made it into my testimony, but it's because it was outside of my scope. But yeah, I wasn't sure really why that was done that way. And it was kind of relates to what Ms. Howard, her rebuttal was. There was I believe a statement in there that said they're not, it's not part of the application, it's separate, but I didn't see a reason why. That's what I was looking for, something like that. And then the other part is that I would say is an omission was in my testimony. I was looking for a complete drainage plan or drainage features, so that's where the springs and the sinks and the flow, because that's what I saw is what number is typical that I see in drainage plans, drainage features, but I didn't see those addressed in the rebuttal testimony at all. So I guess my question still stands. I don't know where they're at.
Those, excuse me, are those the only two concerns left standing for you?
From her testimony, yes.
I believe it's on page 3 of your, there's a question pertaining to addressing the RSD, and your statement was in regards to species, and you referred to the difference between desktop and field survey. And you said that it really needs to be at the species level, and the species level is the bottom of the taxonomy system. There's 8 different levels. And it's, to an extent, attempted to be rebutted by cases that an airplane cannot make this determination. Looking at the 8 levels of the taxonomic system, can any one of those really be ascertained without a field survey?
So for wetlands in particular, there are a few exceptions. There are some plants, I can't remember the common name, but some rushes and sedges and things like that that are considered by the classification system that they're, let's say, obligate. 99% of the time, you're going to find them in a wetland. And so you might not be able to identify the species level of a sedge or rush. There are others, but those are pretty common examples, especially the sedges, that you can identify down to the genus level, like, okay, that's a sedge. And because most of them are considered obligate, most of the time they occur in a wetland. The core allows you, say biologists, to make that assumption that it's an obligate that would be found in a wetland. Likewise, on the other end, there are species that they rarely find themselves in a wetland. They just can't survive the wet soils. So you can make some assumptions on those that they're upland species. But in general, to put a percentage on 95% or so, you have to identify those down to the species level. Yeah, I'll just leave it there. You have to have eyes on the plants in your sample area because those species go on the data form, and there's a couple different methods to use to calculate whether you have hydrophytic vegetation. But all of those identify whether there's or calculate whether there's predominance of that hydrophytic or wetlands vegetation.
So even if you can identify them down to the 7th level, genus level, want to be a Mike Pence here.
I saw that from here.
Even if you can identify down to the 7th level, genus level, it would still necessitate being there if you have to be there at the 8th level, species level.
Ultimately, yes. And desktop analysis is very common. It's a great start. It's a great tool. Nowadays with technology, there's a lot of different elements to that can support some, I'll say, guidance. And heavily used in linear type projects, whether it's a pipeline or aerial type of project, to identify where this thing can go, where things are, we call them red flag analyses. If it's an area with a species of concern, or even wetlands, high quality waterways, those are red flags. Try to stay away from those areas if at all possible. So that's why those linear features kind of zigzag, back and forth. It's a great tool. Just the more complete information you have, the more field survey you have to make decisions. And then ultimately, the regulatory agency, whether state or federal, will need that information to make their determination of the level, quantity and quality of environmental impact, whether it's wetlands, streams, or whatever resources.
Thank you very much for your testimony. That's all I have.
Redirect examination.
Thank you. Just now in your discussion with Commissioner Hansen, you discussed looking at carbon capture facilities. Was that observation based upon your understanding of what a federal review would look at?
I would say yes, because I'm looking at, based on the information in the application, there are going to be water resource impacts. So there's going to be a permit application for the core. therefore they look at whether projects have, whether they're complete, so no piecemeal projects. They want to know what's the impact on everything. They don't like piecemeal projects, and then whether the project has independent utility.
Do you mean the carbon facilities within the ethanol plant? Or the carbon, emitter?
Where they're actually captured. So they can, depending on, the property line doesn't necessarily matter to a permit.
Does wetland delineation need to be completed in order to understand the potential impact the project might have on the environment?
It could, yes, because if the delineations aren't complete, you don't know the exact boundaries of the wetlands. And using the remaining area that has been only surveyed by desktop level, you don't know the exact boundaries of those in relationship to the location of the proposed pipeline. And those could change based on field delineation efforts.
You testified in response to some questions from navigators and attorney that certain wetland issues would be under the Corps' jurisdiction, correct?
Correct.
Would you agree that we nonetheless need to evaluate environmental impacts for our permit determination?
Yes. So individual regulated resources and as a whole.
Thank you. No further redirects.
That brings us to free cross-examination navigator.
I do have a few questions. Mr. Starter, you've given testimony today regarding the injection point of the pipeline and the temperature by which the product being transported is going to exist at the time when it is injected into the pipeline system. Do you recall that?
I do.
And you, I think, stated you're not a soil biologist, correct?
That's correct.
And not a geologist.
That's correct.
Okay. And so you said that I believe that injection temperature could impact soil.
It could.
So you're not expressing that opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, correct?
Well, I'm a biologist, and higher temperatures are lethal to the biota that's in the soils. So I'll give you an example. In an area where, not too far from where I live, there's a natural gas project, pipeline was installed, put into operation, and a well failed, and a static discharge from an overhead line exploded and sterilized a farm field. So unintended consequence, but because of high temperatures, those are super high, but because of high temperatures, it sterilized the field, and that field will lay infertile for an indeterminate amount of time.
Are you aware, other than that example you just gave, are you aware of any scientific literature or studies that support the notion that the temperatures at which the product in this application would be injected into the pipeline would have a negative impact on the soils?
I'm not aware of specific documentation, but when I heard the commissioner mention 120 degrees, that would burn skin. So that would definitely have an impact on soil.
Commissioner Nelson asked some questions about soil compaction and specifically asked a question about whether Navigator had provided anything in writing to the commission addressing that issue. So I would like to turn your attention to ECG, which is Exhibit N19.
We had that open before, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, I kept that open.
So section 6.7 which I believe is on page 43 of the PDF.
Okay, I'm done.
Oh, I'm sorry, I said that incorrectly. It's on page 43 of the document, which is on page 48 of the PDF. Section 6.7 and 6.8 on Exhibit N19 address working in wet soil conditions. Would you agree with that?
Okay, I can't find it here, it's jumping around. What's the section?
Section 6.7 and 6.8.
Okay, I got it.
Would you agree that those two sections address working in wet weather and wet soil conditions?
They do, working in wet weather is discussed here, yes.
Same question for section 4.7.1 of Exhibit N19. Addressing soil decompaction.
Almost there.
It's on page 23 of the PDF.
Yeah, there's, I just have it, I'm there.
Do you agree that section addresses soil decompaction following construction?
Yeah, let me read just a second. The section does deal with soil decompaction, but I'm going to read this for a second. Yes, I would agree with that.
Thank you. One last question. You raised a concern about livestock and other large animals getting stuck in the trench. Do you recall that? Looking at the same document, the environmental construction guidance, section 4.5.2 on page 21. That would be page 21 of the PDF. Let me know when you're there.
I'm there.
So that section is titled Trench Breakers and Plugs. And in the middle of the first paragraph, it talks about trench breakers will be used to facilitate migration of wildlife and movement of livestock. Do you see that?
I do.
Then if you go down to the third paragraph there, we have a bullet point list. And it starts off at the top. It states, trench plugs should be installed in the following locations for wildlife and livestock. And it gives several locations. And then the fourth bullet point down on that list, it states, suitable ramps should be installed from the bottom of the trench to the top with a minimum of 5 foot wide open path across the trench plug. Do you see that?
I see that.
Would you agree that the ramps mentioned there are intended to allow the facilitation of livestock being able to exit the trench?
If they're able to either enter or escape on their own. But what I don't see, and my concern is, what happens if an animal falls into the trench, they're running through the fields, whatever, they fall into the trench, and either they can't get out of there on their own, which the ramps implies that they're going to get out on their own. And the other thing that I didn't see is the plan for what are the steps to be taken if an animal is still entrapped. Is it landowner involvement, so is livestock? Is it coordination, contact with the regulatory agencies, and just a plan to get that animal out of that trench?
All right, thank you. I do not have any other questions.
Recross, Mr. Taylor.
Responsive to Commissioner Nelson's questions about compaction and construction practices, you're familiar with the matting practice that's routinely employed on pipeline construction properties, are you not?
What's the name?
Matting, M-A-T-T-I-N-G, matting practices,
I'm not.
where you put down a mat and drive a cab on the mat.
Okay, that, I thought it was yes, that practice I am.
And that's very common, is it not?
It's very common, especially wet soils.
It's all about economics in the construction business, isn't it? It's easier to put down a mat than it is to pay for the decompaction of the soil.
That would depend on the area and the process used, equipment used. There's a lot of variables there.
Thank you, that's all.
Ms. Bailey, recross.
No questions.
Mr. Jordy.
Just a few on this soil biology question that you and Commissioner Nelson were talking about. Can you help us just understand a bit more of the complexities of the soil biology and how disturbing or introducing foreign materials and increased temperatures as you kind of discussed here today can affect that soil biology?
So there are a lot of factors that can affect soil biology. The one thing I often is you see a stand of trees, wetland there. Well, actually, just a stand of trees that are dead. What killed them? How did they get that big and all of a sudden they're dead? So something has changed. In that case, it's usually water. The roots can no longer be maintained in an aerobic condition, and depending on the species, some just can't handle it and they die. Well, the same thing would apply to, in this case, agricultural soils. Really anything, any change, equal opposite reaction, right? So any change to the soils, if there's a mitigation effort, it would need to be sufficient, complete, to avoid an impact if that's possible, or minimize and then mitigate what does that mitigation look like. And so my concern with these temperature affecting the soils is I just haven't seen the data to know if it's injected at it's 110, 120, that's pretty hot. 110 is a nice warm bath. 120 will burn your skin. I just haven't seen the data. I don't know what the temperatures are, what the gradient would be out to the application of what I recall reading was 1 mile. But the commissioner said, would you say five up to 5 miles or for a little bit more? I don't know what that is. So that's the concern. And with the biology and the biota, there's lots of organisms in the soil. We just don't see them.
And you certainly understand as a scientist that the biota, the organisms in the soil, all play an incredibly important part in the growth of corn and soybeans and the root uptake and the entire plant life cycle. You understand that?
Yeah, I would think it extending beyond that. It's the entire ecosystem, even a micro ecosystem. It's all interrelated.
Absolutely. And sir, how many years or decades have you been providing expert testimony based on your scientific background, education, and training in these type of areas, and specifically related to soil biology?
I would say
Object to the form of the question. The witness is testifying he's not a soil biologist.
Yeah.
Overruled.
I would say look at my hair. No.
Well,
Yeah, for really since 1992.
and do you understand that the degree of certainty to offer expert opinions is more likely than not, or essentially greater than 50%? You understand that's the threshold for expert opinions?
Object to the mischaracterization under the law as
Yes.
to how an expert opinion should be expressed.
So the state. And no. Yeah, the state. Okay.
Well, let me ask you this. Based on your education, training, experience, background, are you able to express to a reasonable degree of professional certainty, not 100% certainty, a reasonable degree of professional certainty, that if the native soil that exists, as it has existed for thousands of years, is intruded with a CO2 pipeline under the operating temperatures that you have learned about through your rigorous study of this docket, that it's more likely than not that that would have a negative effect on the biota in the soil?
Object to the form of the question, improper hypothetical misstates the burden of proof for expert testimony.
Overruled.
And so I would say it varies. If you, I mean, any disturbance of the soil is going to result in a change. Changes aren't necessarily bad, but there will be a change. And it depends on how it's mitigated, what those changes are. The temperature, the degree of temperature, I would say, definitely will have an effect on the more surface soils, because that is the more aerobic zone. Less of an effect on soils that are deeper. Those soils are going to be colder. Normal soil temperature, depends on where you're at, but it's generally 50, mid-50s, something like that, lower 60s. Seasonal, of course. So those things will change. But again, it depends on how it's mediated, restored, mitigated, those final restoration efforts.
And that's exactly the point I'm trying to make. In order for you as an expert to give an opinion based on the data navigator has brought us here to evaluate, and for this commission to evaluate, there's simply a lot of question marks, and you would need more information to make a determination of whether or not the soil biology would be negatively affected such that it would affect the normal farming practices, correct?
Well, I don't know, one thing I don't know is the proximity of certainly the surface features to active, I'm looking into the future, so active agricultural production areas. I don't know what that distance is, that to whether there would be a negative impact or not. I don't know how, I haven't seen the data to know how far those higher soil temperatures would extend from those surface facilities toward production areas.
Okay, so the question mark remains. There's insufficient data to make that determination. Is that fair?
From a biological standpoint.
All right, thank you. Nothing further, sir.
Come back over here for Commissioner Nelson. He has a few more questions for you.
I think it's important that we have very clear on the record what your expertise is and is not, and you testified you are not a soil scientist, and by soil you mean silt, clay, and that part of the soil.
So I don't have, I'll say, credentialed soil scientist as a title or education. I guess because of my experience, just over the years, the type of projects I've been involved with, I do a lot with soil. Especially wetlands, there's very specific characteristics that develop in wetlands. And part of that is looking at soil grain size, mineral soils, topsoils that have a lot of organic material in them, what level of decomposition is there. I think I heard the testimony yesterday about the restoration of cropland, agricultural land, that soil profiles would be reestablished. I think that would be pretty difficult from a construction standpoint. Separating topsoil is one thing, but even topsoil has different zones. You could have A1s and A2. Yeah, so you have to understand that, and I do. It's just based on the projects that I've been involved with. I just don't have those credentials as a soil scientist.
And I appreciate that explanation, that distinction. And by the same token, though, you are an expert in soil biology.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any final, well, let me first just double check with my commissioners. No more questions? Okay. Any final redirect?
No.
Thank you so much for your testimony. You may step down. With that, we will break for lunch. It appears to be about 1 o'clock, so 2:15.
She sounds less convinced about that.
Thanks, Luke.
No, I have other things I'm fighting right now, so especially after breakfast pie, so.
All right. Good. Everyone's going to Pizza Ranch, huh?
Yeah.
Really? Well, don't regret it. Easy on the ice cream machine.